The pen scratched softly against the paper. She barely noticed the sound at first. The room was quiet. Too quiet for a place where money changed hands. She signed where the man pointed, slid the paper back across the table, and finally looked up. That was when she noticed his smile. Not wide, not pleased. Measured. Like something had just gone exactly the way he expected. She didn't know why her stomach tightened. She only knew one thing. She should have read the last page. The listing had been brief. Event attendant, short-term contract, discretion required. That was it. No company name, no long description, just an email address and a promise of payment that made her pause longer than she should have. She needed the money. Not eventually, not next month. Now. So she replied. The response came within minutes. A location, a time, a reminder to bring identification and sign the agreement on arrival. The building wasn't what she expected. No banners, no reception desk, just a private entrance and a man who checked her name against a tablet before leading her inside without a word. The room where she waited was quiet. Too quiet for an event role. Another woman sat across from her, already signing papers. No conversation, no eye contact. When it was her turn, the contract was placed in front of her neatly, the pages aligned perfectly. Standard, the man said. Confidentiality, conduct, duration. She skimmed. Event dates, appearance requirements, professional behavior, a clause about remaining on site until dismissed. Nothing unusual. She hesitated when she reached the last section. You can take your time, the man said calmly. She didn't. She signed. Only then did the man across the table look up. Not surprised, not pleased. Satisfied. You'll be needed this evening, he said. And afterward. She frowned. Afterward? Overnight, he clarified. That wasn't mentioned. It's covered, he said, tapping the contract lightly. Page 37. Her pulse picked up. I wasn't told I'd be staying. You agreed to availability, he replied. This is an extended engagement. She pushed her chair back. I think there's been a misunderstanding. He didn't move. There hasn't. She stood, reaching for her bag. That won't be necessary, he said, his voice still even. She laughed, the sound sharp and reflexive. That's not how event jobs work. The man finally rose. Tall, controlled, close enough that she noticed how carefully everything about him was managed. That, he said quietly, is exactly how this one works. Moments later, she was escorted out. Politely, efficiently. The car waiting outside was unmarked. The doors locked with a soft click as soon as she sat down. As the city began to move past the windows, a cold realization settled in her chest. She hadn't signed up for an event. She had signed herself into something else entirely. The city didn't disappear all at once. At first, it still looked familiar. Traffic lights, storefronts, people walking with purpose, unaware of anything being wrong. She told herself this was still explainable. A misunderstanding, a badly worded contract, an aggressive employer pushing boundaries. The man in the front seat didn't speak. Neither did the driver. She shifted, testing the door handle. It didn't open. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. This isn't necessary, she said, keeping her voice level. I'm willing to walk away from the job. No response. The car turned onto a quieter road. Streetlights thinned. Buildings grew taller, more spaced out. Private. Expensive. She tried again. You can't keep me if I don't consent. This time, the man in the front seat glanced back at her. You did, he said, in writing. Her throat tightened. I agreed to attend an event. And you will, he replied calmly. You'll also remain available until dismissed. That could mean anything. It means exactly what it says. She leaned back, forcing herself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help. Panic never helped. Contracts could be challenged, clauses could be voided. She replayed the document in her mind, searching for loopholes. "What company is this?" she asked. He didn't answer. "What's the client's name?" Silence. The car slowed as it approached a gated entrance. Security lights washed over the hood. The gates opened without hesitation. This wasn't improvisation. This was planned. The car pulled into an underground garage and stopped. No one rushed her. No one grabbed her arm. The door opened, and she stepped out because standing still felt worse. The elevator ride was quiet. Too quiet. When the doors opened, the space beyond was nothing like the office she'd left. Minimal, controlled, immaculate. Not a venue, a residence. "This isn't where events are held," she said. "No," the man replied. "This is where attendees wait." "That's not what I agreed to." He turned to face her fully now. "You agreed to discretion, to availability, to remaining on site." She searched his face for uncertainty, found none. "Who is this for?" "For someone who values preparation." "And after tonight?" He paused, just long enough to feel deliberate. "After tonight," he said, "your role continues." Her chest tightened. "I didn't agree to that." "You did," he repeated calmly. "You just didn't realize how long it would last." She was shown a room, not locked, not guarded. As the door closed behind her, the quiet settled in again. This wasn't an event. It was a holding pattern. And she had the sudden, sinking realization that the ride hadn't been about getting her here. It had been about making sure she couldn't leave. The room wasn't what she expected. There were no cameras in sight, no locks on the door, no obvious signs of restraint. Just space. Too much of it. The bed was neatly made, untouched. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, the city far below reduced to lights without sound. Everything felt deliberate, chosen, as if nothing here existed by accident. She set her bag down slowly. This wasn't a place meant to frighten someone. It was a place meant to convince them to stay. A knock came before she could finish that thought. Not loud, not demanding, measured. When she opened the door, he stood just outside, not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore. "Your schedule," he said, holding out a slim tablet. She hesitated, then took it. "You'll attend the event tonight," he continued. "After that, you'll remain here until further notice." "That wasn't part of the agreement," she said, though her voice was steadier than she felt. He inclined his head slightly. "It was," he replied, "just not emphasized." She looked up at him, really looked this time. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that didn't invite negotiation. He wasn't watching her body language. He was watching her breathing. "What are the rules?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "Rule 1, he said finally. "You don't leave the penthouse without permission." She waited. "Rule 2, he continued. "You don't contact anyone outside." Her grip tightened on the tablet. "And Rule 3? He paused. "You don't ask questions that don't concern your role." "That's convenient," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Silence stretched between them. He didn't step closer, didn't step away, just stood there, occupying the doorway as if it belonged to him. It did. "You'll find everything you need here," he said. "If you don't, you ask." "And if I refuse?" she asked. His gaze didn't waver. "You won't." The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than a threat would have. He turned to leave, then stopped. "The event begins at 8, he added. "Wear something appropriate." "For what kind of event?" she asked. He looked back at her then. The pause was brief, intentional. "One where you'll be noticed," he said. And then he was gone. The door closed softly behind him. She stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in. She explored the space slowly, testing boundaries. The bathroom door opened. The closet held clothes in her size, neutral, elegant, unworn, prepared. When she reached for the window, her reflection stared back at her. She looked composed, unaffected. She didn't feel that way. Later, when a tray of food appeared without explanation, she realized something else. Nothing here demanded obedience. Everything here assumed it. And that was far more dangerous. The first night passed without incident. No guards outside her door, no interruptions, no reminders of where she was. She slept more than she expected to. When she woke, the city beyond the glass was already alive. Morning light softened the sharp edges of the room, making it feel almost ordinary. Almost. Breakfast arrived quietly. No knock this time, just a tray placed on the table while she showered, as if whoever brought it already knew her schedule. She ate slowly, watching the skyline. Hours passed. No one checked on her. No one watched her openly. The absence of pressure was disarming. By the afternoon, she found herself moving through the penthouse without hesitation. Barefoot, calm. She explored corners she hadn't noticed before. Shelves stocked with books she actually liked, a couch positioned perfectly to catch the late light. Everything felt considered. That evening, she attended the event. She was introduced as an attendant, nothing more. No explanations, no expectations beyond presence and discretion. It was effortless. She stood where she was told, spoke when spoken to, smiled politely. No one crossed boundaries. No one treated her like she didn't belong. When it ended, she was brought back just as quietly. No questions, no debrief. Days followed the same pattern. Meals arrived. Silence stretched. Comfort settled in. She stopped checking the door, stopped testing the windows, stopped counting hours. The rules faded into the background, replaced by routine. It was easy to believe this wasn't permanent. Easy to tell herself she could leave when the contract ended. That whatever misunderstanding had brought her here would resolve itself naturally. He appeared occasionally, briefly. Always calm, always distant. Never stayed long enough to be familiar. And that was the strangest part. He didn't watch her like someone guarding property. He watched her like someone measuring time. One evening, she caught herself waiting for the sound of his footsteps. The realization unsettled her. That night, she found the contract again. It lay on the desk where she'd left it days earlier, untouched. Her fingers hovered over the pages. She didn't open it. Not yet. She told herself she'd read it when she felt ready, when she was less tired, when she understood what questions to ask. She told herself she was in control. She didn't know it yet, but that sense of safety, that quiet certainty that nothing bad would happen, was the most dangerous thing in the room.
The trigger came quietly. That was what unsettled her most. Not shouting, not alarms, not panic. Just a name. She wasn't meant to hear it. She knew that immediately. The hallway outside the study was dim, the door slightly ajar. Voices low and controlled. Professional. She slowed her steps without thinking. She settled, a man said. No complications so far. Her chest tightened. Another voice answered. Calm. Familiar. Good. There was a pause. She hasn't questioned the arrangement? Not yet. She will, the familiar voice replied. They always do. The word they echoed in her mind. Her fingers curled slowly at her sides. What if she refuses? The first man asked. She won't. The certainty in his voice stopped her breath. And if she tries to leave? A beat. Then she won't be able to. Her name followed, spoken casually, as if it belonged in the room, as if it had always been there. She stepped back before she could be seen, her pulse loud in her ears. The hallway suddenly felt narrower, longer, as though the space itself had shifted. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she opened the contract. She read it properly this time. Every clause, every condition, every word that had seemed harmless before. The language was precise, cold, legal. Event attendance, extended availability, on-site residency. And then the section she hadn't read, custodial responsibility. She swallowed hard. The contract didn't describe employment. It described possession. Not ownership. That would have been too obvious. Responsibility, protection, control. She had agreed to remain under his authority until dismissal. No end date specified. No conditions listed for release. Her signature sat at the bottom of the page, unmistakable. By the time she finished reading, her hands were shaking. She confronted him before dawn. He was already awake. Of course he was. You knew, she said, holding the contract out in front of her. You knew I wouldn't read it. I told you to, he replied evenly. You framed it as an event job. It was. This is not an event contract, she said, her voice tight. This is protection, he finished. Responsibility. You tricked me. No, he said. I gave you a choice. Her breath hitched. A choice without information is manipulation. He considered that. Perhaps, he said, but you signed. You can't bind someone indefinitely. I can, he replied calmly, when the alternative is worse. She stared at him. Worse than this? Yes. Silence stretched between them. This was never temporary. No. And you never planned to let me leave. He didn't answer immediately. Then, honestly, no. The truth landed heavily. This wasn't romance. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was strategy. She took a step back, her chest tight. You used me. Yes. And now? She asked quietly. And now, he said, his voice lowering just slightly. Letting you go would cost too much. Money? She asked bitterly. He looked at her then. Really looked. No. Something in her expression must have changed. Because he didn't say anything else. She understood. Not everything, but enough. This wasn't about the contract anymore. It was about what he had decided once she was already here. And for the first time since she'd signed her name on that final page, fear returned. Sharp and undeniable. Not because she didn't know what was happening, but because she finally did. She didn't leave his office right away. The silence after his last words stretched too long to ignore.
Cost too much, she repeated quietly. You keep saying that. He remained standing across from her, hands loosely at his sides, posture relaxed in a way that felt intentional. You want numbers? He asked. Details?
I want the truth. A pause.
Then he nodded once. You were never meant to stay, he said. You were meant to stabilize a situation. Her throat tightened. Stabilize how? You were leverage, he answered plainly. A presence that made certain people careful, visible enough to matter, discreet enough not to draw attention. She swallowed. And if I'd refused, you wouldn't have been offered the contract. That's not an answer. It is, he said calmly. Just not a comforting one. She looked down at the paper still clutched in her hands. The signature that felt like someone else's now. And now, she asked again. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. And now you complicate things. She laughed softly, without humor. That's it? I'm an inconvenience? No, he corrected. You are a variable. The words settled heavily between them. You didn't plan for me to matter, she said. No. And now I do. Yes. The admission was simple. Unembellished. More damaging than denial would have been. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not fear this time, but understanding. You don't care what this does to me. He met her gaze steadily. I care about outcomes. And I'm part of one. You are the center of it. She shook her head slowly. You talk like this is abstract, like I'm not standing here. I know you're standing here. That's why this works. Anger flared then, sharp and sudden. You're a monster. He didn't react. I'm honest, he replied. The calm in his voice infuriated her more than cruelty would have. You could let me go, she said. You could undo this. He exhaled slowly, as if weighing the idea. I could, he said, and in doing so, I would expose you to things you are not equipped to face. You don't get to decide that. I already have. The certainty in his tone stole her breath. Why me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He studied her for a long moment. Because you were observant, he said. Because you didn't panic when you should have. Because you adapted. That's not a reason. It's the only one that mattered. Silence followed. She turned away from him then, unable to hold his gaze any longer. You don't even pretend this is about protection, she said quietly. No, he agreed. I stopped pretending when you stopped being temporary. The words landed heavily. She understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be corrected. It was a decision that had already been made. One she hadn't been part of. When he left her alone after that, closing the door softly behind him, the quiet felt heavier than before. Not because she was trapped, but because she finally understood who had decided she would be, and why. The offer came the next morning. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was laid out the way everything else had been, calmly, precisely, as if emotion had no place in it. You can leave, he said. She looked up from the window, the city spread out beneath her like a map she no longer trusted. I'll arrange it, he continued. Transportation, protection until you're clear. Clear of what? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Of my reach, he said finally. Her chest tightened. And after that? After that, he replied, you're on your own. The words should have sounded like freedom. They didn't. And if I stay? She asked. He turned to face her fully. Then you remain here, under my protection, under my rules. And the contract? It stands. She let out a slow breath, trying to quiet the noise in her head. Leaving meant choices, real ones, unpredictable ones. It meant returning to a life that had already been closing in on her before she'd ever answered that email. Staying meant certainty. It meant safety wrapped in control. You make it sound simple, she said. It isn't, he replied, but it is clear. She thought of the nights she'd slept without fear since arriving here. The silence that had replaced chaos. The invisible threats she'd never seen, only felt the absence of. You're asking me to give up my freedom, she said. I'm offering you protection, he corrected. Freedom is expensive. She turned back to the window. The city looked smaller from up here, less forgiving. If I stay, she said slowly, this doesn't turn into something else. He was quiet for a moment. There are no illusions here, he said. Only terms. She nodded once. The decision settled in her chest with unexpected calm. I'll stay. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. He only inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a choice he'd always known she would make. As you wish, he said. When he left the room, the silence returned. But this time it felt different. Not like a trap. Like a door closing. Deliberately. Nothing changed. And yet, everything did. The days that followed slipped into a different rhythm. Not faster, not slower, just settled. She moved through the penthouse without hesitation now, not as a guest, not as someone waiting to leave, but as someone whose presence no longer required explanation. The staff addressed her directly, deferred to her without question. Doors opened before she reached them. She noticed the shift in small ways. A seat reserved without being asked, a pause when she entered a room, a glance exchanged, then lowered. Untouchable. He was still distant, still controlled, still deliberate in every movement, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer watched her to measure time. He watched her to ensure continuity. The city beyond the glass felt farther away now, not unreachable, simply irrelevant. The chaos she'd once lived inside no longer pressed against her thoughts. Here, everything had boundaries, rules, certainty. One evening, as the lights dimmed automatically and the city softened below, she stood at the window and thought about the contract. Not the fine print, not the clauses, just the signature. Her signature. She had thought it was a mistake. She understood now that it had been a decision, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. The world outside would keep moving, dangerous, unpredictable, unconcerned with whether she survived it. Here, nothing touched her without permission. Nothing reached her without consequence. When she turned away from the window, the room felt steady, solid, final. She didn't know if what she felt was relief or resignation. Maybe it was both. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The man who owned the contract always honored his agreements. And now, so did she. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting for you here.